This is Zach from hyperbitsmusic.com here, and today I'm going to be showing you an amazing technique for stealing and using any kick drum from any song in your music. Now, I'm also going to be talking about how you can take that kick drum, clean it up a little bit to make sure you're removing artifacts from the original song so they don't come through in yours. And then I'm going to talk about 3 techniques to enhance that kick drum and make sure that it works well for your track as a more pre-mastered version, seeing as most references that you take from are going to be the mastered final version of the song. So let's just jump right into it. The first thing we're going to need is a song that we want to take the kick drum for. You can use any song here, and again, it doesn't really matter if there's a lot going on during the kick because of the technique we're going to be using. So I'm going to go ahead and use the song Happier by Marshmello and Bastille. It really helps to know the BPM of the song. That way you can really easily isolate the kick's downbeat. I know this song is 100 BPM, but there is kind of a weird intro. So the first thing you're going to want to do is kind of find the kick drum. So I'm going to go towards the drop and find that for us. So, right here at the downbeat of the drop, there's a kick. Now, obviously, the cleaner you can get the kick sample without there being a lot of stuff going on, the better. But it doesn't really matter because of how we're going to do this. So I like to just kind of listen to the first little bit here and find the kick that makes the most sense to take. So it looks like this kind of upbeat kick here seems pretty clean. You can even usually see in the waveform that there's just kind of like that main kick doing most of the work in this part of the song. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of highlight that part and I'm going to separate that audio so that it's by itself isolated. And then what I like to do is line up on a grid line here. We'll just say on 29.4, the transient of this kick. So you can kind of zoom in here and see that, it just kind of starts right there. So I'm going to sort of find it that way whenever I play from here. Right, it's got that transient of the kick drum as kind of the downbeat, the first thing that happens. And then as long as you extend this to where you're capturing the full length of the kick sample, which, this kick sample is pretty short, but just to be safe, we can listen all the way until the next snare, which is going to be right about there. And then once we have that, the first and kind of most important thing you're going to do is to separate this kick based on the frequencies. So I like to use a Ozone 8 stereo imager for this, but you can use any plugin that can separate and solo different frequencies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just drop the Ozone 8 imager onto the kick sample here, and I'm going to go ahead and break this down into 4 different bands. The bands don't matter entirely as long as you have kind of a sub band, a low mid band, an upper mid, and then a top end band. I like the breakdown of the Ozone imager for this, which is just everything below 140, between 140 and 2000, between 2000 and 10,000, and then above. So I'm going to solo below 140. Then I'm just going to simply duplicate this track. And on this imager right here, I'm going to solo between 140 and 2000. And then so on and so forth for the top 2 bands of between 2000 and 10,000 and above 10,000. And the reason why we do this is because when we actually convert this now to audio, you'll be able to see the kick sample broken down by frequency, which allows you to fade each set of frequencies independently, allowing you to isolate the kick drum. So if we just go ahead and freeze and flatten this to convert it to audio, you can also resample if you're not in a DAW like Ableton. You can actually see now that we've got kind of the frequencies of this kick broken down into different parts. And this is great because it allows us to fade and remove chunks of the song depending on the frequency band that aren't in the kick sample. So we can see that starting with this low end here, you can really hear that everything beyond this kind of initial punch here is another sound coming in post the kind of the sidechain effect. So if you go in here and you actually just come and fade the sample down to where just the kick exists, you can really hear just the punch of that kick drum coming through. Now, this is obviously something you want to finesse, and depending on the kick sample and the song, you might have more or less information, kind of you're happy with bleeding through, but we can tighten that up later anyway. But so we'll go through each band, and make sure we kind of have what's there. The next band and the kind of theme as you move up in frequencies is you can usually get more information taken away because the clicks of kicks and the top ends of kicks are usually really short. So we can hear with this band has a lot of that mid-range. Pretty much everything past about here is other sounds. So we can come in here and really nicely tighten this up. Obviously, you can hear the difference between leaving all of this in and tightening this up a little. I prefer to have it tighter and not have as many artifacts, but you can leave a little bit in if it makes the kick sound a little better. We'll go to this next section, and the more you do this, the more you'll kind of notice where these samples, and depending on the frequencies, how long they last. So I'll come down to about here, fade this even tighter. And then we'll go to the final frequency here. Usually the top end, depending on how clicky the kick is, might not have that much information at all. And in fact, in this song, the kick doesn't really have a huge top end. So, we can probably get away with removing quite a bit of this. Just that little tiny click that you can kind of barely hear. And now when we listen to all these together, really isolated down to that final kick. Now, what's great about this is you kind of have the freedom to play with it as much as you want, and you end up getting a slightly different timbre than the original kick anyway, but you still have kind of the main importance of that kick there. Now, I want to talk about how you can clean up this kick sample and make it just a little bit tighter and a little bit better. So one really awesome technique is to just figure out which layers are kind of the messiest and potentially use some mid-side EQ to remove some of the stuff that's on the sides. Because for most kick samples, you just need it to be right down the middle. So for instance, this layer kind of has a little bit of information still from the original song. So I can just take a simple EQ that has mid-side options here and isolate down just those middle frequencies and then remove on the sides anything that I feel like is getting in the way. So pretty much things that are kind of like above a certain frequency here. Right, just kind of removing some of that unnecessary side higher information that might be bleeding through from other instruments. Really quick and easy way to tighten some stuff up. I've actually found that a lot of times you don't need to go crazy here because it's such a short instance of time that you're stealing from that usually, you can get away with a little bit of bleed from another song. But that is a great technique using mid-side to be able to clean up anything that still kind of bleeds a little bit too much. Now, the other option is to actually further make this kick a little bit more focused is to make certain layers mono. So we can actually listen to the difference between some of these layers being in stereo and mono. If we take this layer that we've been already EQing and we kind of change it to mono, you don't really hear a difference. And that's because this original kick sample was already pretty mono to begin with. And we've done a great job of removing any of these kind of other frequencies from the sound that are getting in the way. But if there is a problem with maybe, you're taking a lot more stereo information than you want, you can always come through and make stuff more mono so that it feels more like a kick drum. We can try it on this layer as well. And that tightens it up a little bit, makes that layer a little bit more punchy down the middle. Now I want to talk about 3 additional techniques you can use to kind of make this kick even a little bit more intense, and depending on your production, maybe have a little bit more life and kind of make it your own, especially with the top end of the kicks, because a lot of times I find that the hardest part to kind of steal is the more clickiness, because there's always a lot of high frequency information happening right at the downbeat of kicks in really full drops, and if they're not using a lot of side chain, it might be hard to really isolate that. So in order to add that transient back in, the first technique I like to try to do is add a transient top layer. So I'm just going to add an audio track, and some of my favorite samples for this are actually in the Cashmere pack. He has a bunch of really cool top kicks. If you go to his kicks, this top kick folder just has a bunch of really cool transient top layers you can layer in any kick. So something like that sounds really nice and just kind of adds that extra click. So we can immediately hear the difference. Right? Having that top kick layer really punch through can help in your mix, have it really, really pop. So I definitely encourage you to play with adding top kick layers, especially to a kick sample like this that already kind of doesn't have a lot of top end based on the sample itself. And then it's just a matter of kind of mixing it into the right volume. And I'm going to go ahead and loop this section so we can kind of easily do this. So something right about there sounds nice for this kick, just giving it a little bit of extra top. Now, the second technique is that you can kind of do the same thing, but in regards to punch. Now, this isn't always necessary because a lot of times the kick sample itself already has a decent amount of punch, especially with a sample like this that we were able to do such a great job with these kind of two first layers, the subby layer and the low mids. But if you ever find your kick just kind of not punching through, another great idea is to layer in one of these punchy kicks from Cashmere. You can also use pretty much any kick sample at this point that has good punch, but I like to use some of these punchy kicks, especially some of these ones down here in the Gs. I really like this 36G soft. So if I go ahead and drag that in here and we just listen to as is what that does. Way too much, and there's definitely a lot of overlap. So what you have to do in this situation is you actually have to very fine tune and EQ just that punchy part of the kick you're looking for. So what I like to do is I'll just come over here and I'm going to remove all of this top end, like way down to like about 300, 250, somewhere in there. And then even remove some of the bottom end that's kind of in the way of our subby layer. So you can hear that subtle addition to the bottom punch of the sound. And again, you would just come in here and kind of fine tune the volume and as well as the fade of this, because we have our kick being a little bit shorter. So I think having this punchy layer be a little bit quicker to release. Makes that sound a lot better. It's got that extra little punch level to it at the end. Now, the final technique here to kind of beef this up and get this to the final finished version is to simply clip this whole thing because we've added some layers, we've stripped the kick within the full mastered song. So I want to make sure that we go ahead and not let this go above 0 and just kind of do a final level of processing to just clip it. So what I like to do is just group all of these together, and then I just simply use Transient Shaper by Native Instruments, but you can use any plugin that has a hard clipping or limiting feature to just tame that final transient. The reason why I like to use the Transient Master here by Native Instruments is because I can also add additional transient kind of punch, as well as maybe even reducing the sustain of the sound to make it a little tighter. So we can see it's not really changing the timbre of the sound too much, but we're going from clipping by almost 2 dB to hitting right at 0, which is just a nice final level to be hitting for your kick sample when you bring this into your track later on. Most samples you hear are normalized and hitting up at 0 anyway, so this is just kind of a great final level. And then all you do from at this point is simply resample this or convert it to audio. So now I've got this audio sample as a kick drum. And it sounds very, very, very similar, if not identical, to our original kick drum from the Marshmallow track.